One's practice then is much deeper. It isn't a visualization then. It isn't a pretending. It isn't a acting in what can be an even more neurotic way, and that is acting differently than you really feel. It isn't putting a Band-Aid on an ulcer. Instead, one practices in such a way that one learns to the depth of one's heart that this is fruitless. This continuation of this continuum is fruitless. How can we go about learning that? We should use the capabilities of our mind even as we have them right now. Even the part of us that likes to have ideas, even the part that conceptualizes, even the part that imagines, the part that's making all the trouble. Let's put it to work. And the way that you put it to work is you try to consider all of the different circumstances of your life and consider them in a weighty way. Not say, oh, this is not going to bear me any fruit, or oh, this is not according to the Buddha's teaching, and just pass it off in that way. But to the point, and inasmuch as you are able, you consider it, each portion of your life, and how it might possibly develop. For instance, let's say that a big factor or a big deal in our lives might be, let's see what, prosperity. Okay? Let's say that prosperity is important. Let's say we have a lot of stuff around money. I've heard that phrase so much. I have a lot of stuff around money. I'm either too poor with it or too rich with it, or plenty rich but also very poor, or whatever it is that we have with money. So we've got a lot of stuff around money and having. So having stuff around money, we have to look at it. Let's look at it and try to imagine the absolute best situation with money. I mean, what do you want? You have to ask yourself, what do you want? And you should really consider this exactly. Don't be ashamed. If you really want to be unbelievably rich, I mean, if that's really what you want, you should say so. Be honest with yourself. If you want to be just reasonably rich, then you should say so. Whatever your thing is with money, do it honestly and clearly. And be real, most of all, be truthful. If it's about being unbelievably rich, go for it. Go for it. And then try to imagine the best case scenario. Absolute best case scenario. Best case scenario for some people would be that you would win it through the lotto and not have to earn it. If that is the best case scenario, then try to imagine that. If, however, you have some kind of noble savage thing attached to it, and you think it would be great if you could somehow finally use that immense talent that the world has never discovered in you, much to their shame, and having discovered that, suddenly they pay you for it as much as you're worth. And in paying you, they tell you that you are worth so much. And you've got this whole thing. Whatever your best case scenario is, you write it out. Write it out just like a script. And really play it right down the road. I mean for you to do that. Don't be ashamed. Play it right down the road. What's the best case scenario? A total freebie, or everybody loves you, or you become king of the world, or what is your thing with prosperity? Whatever it is, it happens to you. And try to imagine all of the best case scenarios that could spring from that. Like everybody loves you. And even though everybody loves you, you find out that it's really not for money, it's just that now they know you better. And somehow you develop this proof that even if you didn't have your money anymore, they would still be here for you. But all of these things, you play them right down the road and you've got them all worked out. And even if all of your best case scenarios come through, you will find a flaw in it. It's never going to be complete. Because even if you are ultimately unbelievably rich to where you could buy anything, not everything's going to be available. And even if everything was available, you can't use them all at one time. For instance, what if you like to drive a car, ride a motorcycle, and ride a bike? And if you had the best of all kinds, maybe 150 of the best of all kinds, then you have to deal with the frustration of which one you're going to do. And even if you could figure out which one you're going to do, if you are that kind of amazingly anal retentive, decisive person, you could decide exactly what you're going to do and then time yourself and 20 minutes later go on to the next one. Even if you could do all of that, you're going to get tired doing that. It's not going to be enough. Anyway, you're going to go through all of these scenarios and still there's something that eludes you. And even if somehow you manage to be happy because you're a superficial little son of a gun and all you really want is things to ride around in, then what's going to happen is you're going to age. Yes, you are. I'm sorry, Estee Lauder has not got it knocked yet. So no matter how much makeup you put on, it's still happening underneath. I know that this is true. And even if you age gracefully, you will age ultimately. And eventually, you will sicken. Even if you can buy every cure there is, some cures don't work. Everything's fallible. And ultimately, you experience death, as all beings experience death. No matter how much money you haven't bought the liberation from death, you see. I mean, you can freeze yourself, but nobody knows that's going to work. We just don't know. And so you have not really bought yourself freedom. Let's say, for instance, you have, your thing is not prosperity, but it's about relationships. You do the same thing. Work out relationships. Let's say that you think that everything will be solved if you could get married happily ever after. Boy, are you ever dumb. But anyway, you think that everything can be solved if you could get married happily ever after. Then play the whole scenario out. You meet Mr. or Ms. Wonderful, and they're gorgeous, and you're gorgeous too. And the passion is so remotely possible, I mean great, that whenever you walk into the same room together, even the plants wilt. You know, and it remains, it is eternal. It never ceases. From the time that you first meet strangers in the night until the time that you're 95 and you view each other for the last time. Whenever you see each other, you run or eventually limp into each other's arms, just like the old Breck commercials. You remember the old Breck shampoo commercials, bounding through the fields into each other's arms. And let's say that you're also, because you're so desirable, you're also fertile. And you have lots of children, but it's okay because you're rich enough to have nannies to take care of them. And you have lots of children, and you're so completely fertile, it's like unbelievable. And all of your children are extremely gorgeous. And they all grow up to be doctors. And they all take care of you in your old age, which you don't need, but they insist on doing it anyway, because you're already rich and so are they. And anyway, you play this entire scenario down to the nth degree. And you know, you still haven't bought yourself freedom from suffering, you see, because you still have sickness, you still have old age, you still have death, and these are the sufferings of the human realm. So, in playing all of this out, and you should play out in detail all the things you thought you wanted to be, all the things that you never quite made, all the things that you wished could have happened. Just get busy, have a good time. Really think about it. Really, best case scenarios all the way, 100%. And then think about the odds that things are going to end up in their best case scenario. Think about the unpredictability of events, of karma. Think about how things ripen always differently than you think. Think about how when you're so excited this time, this thing's really going to work. Haven't you ever felt like that? You have a new project or something new's going on, and you think this is going to be the one that makes me famous. And you have it's just, well, it's the insight that is going to break you into genius, or the meditation that's going to push you into enlightenment, or the understanding that's going to make you world famous, or the object that you have that is finally going to fill the gap in your life, or the relationship that's going to fill the gap in your life. And think about how many times something like that has happened, and hidden within that experience is the experience of knowing that there is disappointment there, because eventually it will come to an end, or it will not be as fruitful as you thought, or it will not be quite the way you thought, or there will be extenuating circumstances that will alter the experience in some way. And lo and behold, at some point, whatever it is turns out to be not quite what you thought it was going to be. So you play all of these things through, and you come out with the idea, actually, that there is no future in doing what we do, and continuing to operate from this superficial point of view, continuing to try to make self happy, continuing to try to continue the continuum of self, continue to develop the very perceptual process to live within the confines of one's own exaggeration process. All of the things that we have been involved with, all of the ideas, the best laid plans of mice and men, you can, on your own, from your own experience, from playing things through and from watching your life, realize that there's simply no future in that kind of thing. And many people, before actually seriously entering onto a path of supreme generosity, come to the point where they are sickened, tired of, or have lost faith with self-absorption, with selfish activity. They have come to realize that it has never brought them even a moment's happiness. That all of the temporary gratification that we experience when we're involved in that kind of activity is illusory, in that it always results in disappointment. And coming to that conclusion on your own is the best way to do it. Because coming to that conclusion on your own, it becomes deeply ingrained. One begins to assume, perhaps not to the degree that the Buddha does, perhaps not in the way that the Buddha does, but something like what the Buddha assumes when the Buddha realizes the fallibility of that kind of activity. When one realizes the fragile and impermanent nature of any temporary joy that is brought about through the process of self-absorption, or the concentration on self-nature as being really real. From the Buddha's point of view, the Buddha realizes that because the Buddha realizes the nature. Perhaps we cannot truly realize the nature, but we can realize the unlikelihood that fruit will come from planting an imaginary tree. That is to say, if we continue making up stories based on a presupposition that is not inherently true, it is not likely that we will eat much fruit. Or the fruit that we gain will be like the tree. It will be diluted. It will be impermanent. It will be laced with disappointment. And it will be confined and limited within the realm of cyclic existence. If instead we count on the Buddha's teaching, or at least the philosophy that the true nature is the primordial wisdom state, and that the ego-centricity is not the true state. If we rely at least on that, we can begin to decide for ourselves how to act appropriately. Under those conditions, if we learn, and the thing that has to be mentioned here is that you have to learn this to your bones. I mean, to your core, to your blood. It has to be learned all the way in. You can't just think about this for half an hour and say, yeah, it sounds right to me, you know, and sort of go on with it. You have to learn it to the depth of your heart. You have to be certain. When I practiced the practice that I'm going to give you this afternoon, that was the process that I engaged in first. I lived on a farm. I had very little to do. I spent a great many hours a day in meditation, and I meditated on what was given to me naturally to meditate. And my first meditations were about that. And I used to call that period of time leaving the party. It's really what, I'll just share that with you. That's what I used to call it, leaving the party. And I used to have lots of dreams at that time of being at a party and watching people at this party be drunk. They were kind of drunk, you know, and they were drinking these drinks that were causing them to act inappropriately. And their inappropriate behavior made them look foolish, and they didn't know it. And their inappropriate behavior made them not understand what was happening to them. Like, for instance, their clothes, sometimes I would dream that their clothes fell off and they didn't know it. And sometimes I would dream that they even went to the bathroom and didn't know it. And sometimes I would dream that they got lost or wandered off and didn't know it. And I could see that very clearly. And I decided to leave the party because the party was not the place to be. And so that period of time is a very precious period of time. To me, I could not have done the practice that I did after that if I did not examine very closely and really in a very analytical way, in a very ordinary way, all of the different methods that I had employed to survive, all of the different hopes that I had, all of the different ideas that I had as to how life should be or would be. I examined very, very deeply for myself. And I was a young mother at that time. I had a son. My oldest son, who's now 19, was a year old. And boy, they're cute at that age, you know? And there's this motherly part that just wants to eat that little muffin up, not do anything else but eat that little muffin up, and just be completely involved in that process. And yet, through my meditation, I realized that I would neither do him, nor any sentient being, nor myself any good if I allowed myself to become so enmeshed in the process of mothering that it became the totality of my life, that it became the reality of my existence, that nothing else was happening besides that. That, in fact, I would have nothing to offer him, or at least I wouldn't have any more to offer him than any other mother in cyclic existence, and I had hoped that I could give him something else. And so I began to even really look at you know, the best case scenario with mother. What if this cute little muffin somehow manages to grow up into a grown man, a doctor and a rich one, with the most sensitive and yet virile young man in the world? I mean, just think of what you could possibly ask for in a man. Just think for everything that you could want your son to be. And I thought of just everything. I really dragged all the stuff out of the closet that I didn't even know I felt about anything. And made up a son, you know. And what if he turned out to be all of those things? And what if he lived to be 95? And what if I did too? And what if neither one of us died before the other one? And somehow. And what if, I don't know, you know, and I just made up this whole best case scenario. And I realized that the best case scenario is a myth. That it is a myth. I realized that if I could offer this child any nurturing, then I should be able to look in this child's eyes and say, I will not abandon you with surety. Because I would know that as a Buddha, perhaps I could help him. And I can only do that if I myself attain Buddhahood. I can only do that if I practice. So these are the conclusions that I came to, and they enabled me to practice. My recommendation then is to do this with every circumstance, particularly those circumstances that are central in your life. And you should examine them from the most obvious. Perhaps money might be a very obvious one. Material things might be an obvious one. Or relationships might be a very obvious one. To the most subtle. And these are the ones that are the toughest. These are the ones that I strongly recommend, however. The ones in which you find that it is perhaps your personality type to want to be superior, you know, or it is your personality type to want to be smart and to have an intellectual edge over someone else. Or you saw yourself on video and you noticed that you constantly look meaningfully at people. And from that you learned about yourself that you really would like to look deep. And learning that you would really like to look deep, you need to follow that one through and see what the best case scenario about deep is. I can help you there. So really work this out and really watch yourself. And here's a great opportunity to watch the nature of your mind and play out all of these different scenarios. What does this have to do with supreme generosity? It has everything to do with supreme generosity. If you are practicing it from the ultimate view, if you are practicing it from the most profound way, you must then be practicing it as a Buddha would practice. For the reasons that the Buddha practices. For the reasons, rather, that the Buddha generates compassion. The Buddha doesn't practice, the Buddha's got it nailed. Supreme generosity naturally occurs within the Buddha because the Buddha has learned the true nature. The Buddha is awake, I should say, to the true nature. Is fully aware of the true nature. And having viewed all of that, the Buddha has, as its very quality, supreme generosity, naturally occurring. So when you play out these best case scenarios, you do so in order to, in whatever way you are able, to accomplish something of what the Buddha understands when the Buddha understands completely all knowledge, when the Buddha has that omniscience. Of course, we cannot understand cause and effect relationships before the time of our birth. We cannot follow them through. We can only imagine them, or after our death. Yet we can develop something of the same edge or the same flavor of what the Buddha knows. And someday, we will have that omniscience. when we realize our own nature through our practice, then that will be a naturally occurring thing, not something that needs to be practiced. So, when and only when you have understood at least the cause and effect relationships that you are involved in, at least the circumstances of your life, from the most gross and visible to the most subtle, including your tendencies and your character traits, the ones that you think you just can't seem to get rid of. Until you have followed them to the end, and using all best case scenarios, and figured out the odds that they will all be best case scenarios, and come to the conclusion without any doubt, that there is no future in that kind of activity. Until that time, you cannot hope to practice supreme generosity at its most profound level. Simply because we will be following rules, or we will be doing something to get a desired result, we will not be practicing in the same way that the Buddha practices, realizing the true nature and realizing the fallibility of cause and effect relationships. And that really is of the utmost importance. In Vajrayana practice, we focus a great deal on the practice of Lama, Yidam, and Khandro. The Lama is considered to be the embodiment of all the blessings of the Buddha. And in the Nyingma tradition, we consider Guru Rinpoche as our supreme object of refuge within that context. We practice also the Yidam, or meditational deity. Another way to describe Yidam is meditational deity. And there is not one certain meditational deity that is practiced. Within each lineage, there are many different deities that are practiced. They all have the enlightened qualities of the Buddha. That is to say that they have attained realization, and they are considered to have those enlightened qualities. And actually, when one practices the meditational deity, it is considered that one is practicing the qualities of the Buddha, all of the embodiment of all of the qualities of the Buddha. And we have one main Yidam practice that we do here in this center, and it is Chemcho Karuka. But we also practice many meditational deities. So it should not be thought of as one meditational deity, but rather that whenever you are practicing a meditational deity, you are practicing all of the qualities of the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas, of the 10 directions. Then also, we practice Khandro. And Khandro is the Dakini practice. And when one practices Dakini practice, it is considered that one is practicing all of the activity of the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas of the 10 directions. Traditionally, the Dakini is considered to be a female primordial wisdom being. That is how they are depicted. The male in that category would be called the Daka, but the Dakini is the female primordial wisdom being. She is considered to be enlightened or realized, and she is considered to represent all of the sum total of all of the activities of all the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas in the 10 directions. When you consider all the sum total of all the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas in the 10 directions, you cannot do so without considering from where do these activities spring. In order to do so, one must consider where our activities spring from. And when we consider our activities as ordinary sentient beings, not having fully awakened, and yet having as our potential the Buddha nature, while not being awakened to it, we discover that all of our activities arise, as I previously described, from a preconception of the belief in self-nature as being inherently real. In a sense, that is the center of the mandala of our activity. The initial supposition of self-nature. Once self-nature is supposed, all activity that arises from that consideration. As do all perceptions, and even all qualities, and all conditions. They all arise from the underlying supposition of self-nature as being inherently real. According to the Buddha, all perceptual process that occurs after that supposition is based on delusion. It is therefore a deluded process. You cannot assume that it is not a deluded process if it is based on delusion. The seed and the fruit are the same, you see. So that all of the activities that we are engaged in, so long as we are operating in an egocentric fashion, will continue to be based on delusion, will continue to be actually neurotic from that point of view that they are inappropriate to our true nature. While all of our activity arises from that assumption, this is not the case with the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas, and therefore it is not the case with the Dakini. The Buddhas and Bodhisattvas, as I have described, have the twofold accumulation of perfect knowledge and perfect wisdom. That is to say, they are awake to the primordial nature, and they are fully aware of cause and effect relationships and of interdependent origination. That is to say, how one circumstance arises from another and continues to arise, and how they are so completely interdependent and woven into one another. As the representation, in a sense, of all the activities of all the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas of the 10 directions, the Dakini is considered to have that same awareness. So while our activity, as ordinary sentient beings, arises from the basic deluded perception of self-nature as being inherently real, the activity of the Dakini then arises instead from pure cognition, arises instead from the recognition of emptiness, of the primordial wisdom state. When the Dakini is seen in visualization, she is always seen in a wrathful or semi-wrathful way, or usually seen rather in a semi-wrathful or wrathful way. She is seen with some indication that her activity arises from the nature of emptiness. For instance, if we think of the Dakini Dorji Pagbo, she's always seen with a curved Vajra blade in her hand. And that curved Vajra blade isn't something that she cuts up her hot dogs with. You know, it isn't something that she carves a turkey with. That curved Vajra blade is considered, and it's oddly shaped, it has a little curlicue at the end, and that little curlicue actually is considered to be the hook of compassion. That curved Vajra blade, then, is considered to cut off attachment at the root. And remember what the root of attachment is. All that stuff we talked about earlier, it wasn't for nothing. The root of all attachment, then, is desire, which is based on the belief in self-nature as being inherently real. The Dakini then engages in that activity. She's holding that implement, so she engages in that activity. Through the generation then of that activity, through the realization of her, through the generation of the Dakini, through the realization of her activities, one then engages in the process, in one's practice, of cutting off attachment at the root. Through one's practice, one realizes oneself to be the same nature as the Dakini. Realizing oneself to arise spontaneously and naturally from the nature of emptiness. To know one's nature to be the same as the nature of emptiness. To know oneself as consistent with the nature of emptiness. And one practices, therefore, accordingly. The Dorji Pagmo, for instance, holds in her other hand a skull cup filled with blood. And we might think, ooh, what a lunch. If we were to assume with some kind of ordinary view that she were just holding an object in the way that we would hold an object, with desire as the motivation. And that's the difference, isn't it? Desire is the motivation. When we hold up a cup of anything, it's all about us. You see? Water for me. That's what I have here. Yummy. Watch this. But when Dorji Pagmo holds up her cup, she does so engaged fully in the activities of the Buddhas, of all the Buddhas, fully engaged in that. Her activity arising spontaneously from the fullness of her wisdom, holding up the cup, the skull cup filled with blood. It is not an object of attraction or repulsion to her. It is a symbol of the sameness, in essence, of attraction and repulsion. It is a symbol of the absolute sameness and union of form and formless, of matter and emptiness. It is a symbol of the realization of the underlying true nature, which is even beyond the understanding of emptiness and fullness. which is even beyond the understanding of dirty and clean, which is even beyond the understanding of attractive or repulsive. And so it is with that wisdom that she engages in the activity of consuming all phenomena, because she consumes it in its natural state. Whereas when we drink water for us. And there's the difference. All of our activity, all that we engage in, all perceptual process, all of the gross activity in our lives, everything arises from the belief in self-nature as being inherently real. The Dakini's activity is the activity of all the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas, come from the same wisdom, from the same pristine, pure cognition, from the same realization of the primordial wisdom state, from the same luminosity. And so, the activity that is the Dakini is pure. And it is considered to be inseparable from purity, in that the place that it arises from is a place of absolute purity, is emptiness, pure cognition. Therefore, the fruit must be consistent. And the Dakini is always shown as the slayer of ego. And when, as ordinary people, when we think of slayer, we think of violence and nasty, and oh, this is bad. It's kind of like on Hill Street Blues. You know, everybody's killing everybody. It's like that. And we get upset about the thought. And it's because when we slay, when we kill, as ordinary sentient beings, we cannot do so in the same way that the Dakini does. It isn't the same thing at all, because our activity arises from the foundational supposition of self-nature as being inherently real. The Dakini's activity arises from pure awareness, arises from the awareness of emptiness, and also from the other accumulation of the true Buddha, which is the arising of, the accumulation of knowledge. So she has that twofold accumulation. She has that pristine awareness. And so from that pristine awareness, the only activity that can naturally occur is the activity that brings about the cessation of the causes of suffering. That is the only activity that can come from that pure, pristine awareness. And so while the Dakini is seen in this wrathful posture, she should be understood as being the sum total of all the activities of the Buddhas, and the activities of the Buddhas can only be to undermine to sever, I should say, the attachment to ego, the confinement by ego. That is the only activity that can occur within that realm. So it remains consistent, and to understand this activity truly, you must understand the source. And please, I ask you to think this through for yourself, because if you just listen to me and take my word for it and act then in a very superficial way, what you're going to do is you're going to say, well, she says ordinary people do things this way, but Dakinis do things that way. And if you think in that way, then you won't know why you should take my word for it. What you have to do is to examine the source of the activity follow it through. Understand that the Dakini is considered to be the activity of all the Buddhas, that she is the activity aspect. She is the activity aspect of the Buddhas. And that the Buddha's understanding, the Buddha's awakened state contains the twofold accumulations and the pure, pristine cognition of nature. Natural cognition, I should say. And from that, only pure activity can arise. In the same way that logically, only apple trees can come from apple seeds, that never has there been a time when a banana tree has come from an apple seed. In the same way, you have to follow the logic through, and it is the same logic. And in order to follow that logic through, you must understand the many different building points that we laboriously made in order to get to this point. But these are necessary in order to understand. Primarily in order to understand how you should practice, how we should think of our practice, and what steps should we go through in order to get to that point. So when we think of the activity that is the Dakini, we think of the activity of liberation, the activity of all the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas compiled into one. That aspect is the activity of liberation, because that is the only result that the enlightened Buddha can bring about, is liberation. It is the only result possible. Nothing but liberation can come from that.